Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We have been doing a series of webinars on various topics. One of the topics that has been coming up over and over again is document processing in general. However, there's also always a data security aspect of document processing that generally gets into play a little further down the road once the solution's been looked at and the solution's being architected. A lot of questions come up. The purpose of today's webinar is not a session on data security, but to give folks an idea of the data flows, transmission of data within a document processing workflow. And to talk on this topic, I am very honored to have Robert Love from our partners UiPath join us. And on the Accelirate side, my name is Ahmed Zaidi. I'm your host today. I'll be speaking on this topic. Along with me is Jason Valladares. He is an engineer within our organization and has been working to implement quite a few of these document processing solutions. So, Robert, would love to send it over to you for a quick introduction before we get into the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ahmed. So yes, like I mentioned, I'm Robert Love. I've been with UiPath for almost 2 years, working as a technical consultant for a variety of customers. And we've definitely seen a lot of uptick in terms of our document understanding and document processing capabilities being used across those customers. So I'm honored to be here today to hopefully inform a little bit more about some of what we see as it relates to general security practice.
So before we get into the actual solutions and some of the mitigation techniques, I wanted to point out what are the general data security risks involved, and these are generic to a lot of things that you may do within your organization. But data leakage being one of the big ones. You have some data that has some sort of classification, and then you end up either putting it inside the org in an unsecure location or sending it outside the organization where you're not supposed to. The other exposure is data exposure to an unauthorized person. Whether this exposure is intentional or unintentional, I mentioned both because there are cases where, for example, we have a customer who had a shared service group that was responsible for doing some validation on documents, and some of the documents that were being validated only for precision of the OCR, which is whether this is an I or an L, a 0 or an O or something like that. And that's what this group was doing. However, they weren't authorized to see some of the documents that were coming through within that OCR workflow. So this was an example of sort of a process design where the data was exposed to folks who weren't supposed to see it. Data storage in an unsecure location, I talked a little bit about that, but putting data in a location that's either unsecure, whether that be on some file share or outside in the cloud, or even on some desktop somewhere where it might be accessed by folks that should not have access to it, or have access to it beyond the purview of their work, that's also another exposure. And data transmission using an unsecured channel, again, this is not as applicable when you're doing, using HTTPS channels and secure API communications. These days, they are fairly tight. However, there is a chance that you may be sending something out over an unsecure route or an unapproved route from within your policies. So these are all sort of risks that we see. And at the end of the day, any one of these things may result in a violation, right? And the violation might be a violation of your either internal InfoSec policies, or worse, it could be a regulatory violation of either, sending out patient identifiable information against HIPAA laws or PCI for credit card, or any of the other regulatory rules that may apply to your organization. You may end up in a violation of any of those. So these are sort of at the high level risks that we see. I'll talk a little bit about some of the mitigations. The first thing that folks need to understand in a document processing flow is understanding the classification of the data that you are going to be processing through your workflow. Now, the challenge with document processing as opposed to your applications generally tag data really well, right? So there's a social security field. It is very it's secure on the front end. It's masked. It's not visible. You know, the dots or the stars that you see in the database. It is encrypted, and it's very clearly marked as a social security number. So when transmission's happening, folks know that this data cannot go out, so on and so forth, right? However, in a document processing workflow, you don't know what's on that document. You may know that this is an invoice, or you may know that this is a customer onboarding form. You may know that this is a receipt, but a lot of times you may not know that there might be additional information. For example, an invoice may be accompanied with supporting documentation that might contain PII, right? So you don't. The challenge that a lot of folks are presented with is the fact that within a document processing workflow, you really don't know what is on the document with 100% certainty, and there's a possibility that something that may seem innocuous and may not contain PII or any of the other data that's either considered highly sensitive or private, be it from an InfoSec perspective or be it from a regulatory perspective. You may have that information on that document, and in order to process it, you need to take a little bit of care and understand how that's going to be processed. So having said that, understanding what the classification of the data that you're processing within the documents that you're going to put through a document processing workflow is extremely important. So how you put your mitigation techniques in place really depends upon understanding a few things. So first, understanding the data flow between various components, and we'll go into further detail of those components within the workflow, and understanding what is staying on-prem, what is going to the cloud. If you're using RPA, which most of our clients are, and that's our bread and butter day in and day out, understanding how the bot itself, where the bot machine sits, how it actually accesses the source of that document, where it downloads, where it keeps that, and how it transmits to the document processing workflow. These are all things that you need to think about. Whether that does the bot take an email and forward it to another email address or something like that. These are things that you have to understand and make sure that they're not violating any of those InfoSec policies that you may need to adhere by. The other thing, so one is the data flow. The other thing to understand is to understand the storage of data. Where is the data being stored? Whether that is being stored temporarily or permanently. Whether that storage location is on-prem or whether that is in the cloud, and where in the cloud and how in the cloud it's there, what parts of it, what form it takes in the cloud, and then understanding any copies that are made of that document. So there are many times you may make a temporary copy. Many times you would, for instance, in retraining, you might make a copy of not the document, you might make a copy of the data that is extracted out of the document and store it somewhere for retraining purposes. So all those things need to be considered and figured out. And then if it's temporary, then you need to figure out what is going to be the archival and purge timing for those things. And these are all things that you have to understand. And once you understand this, again, once you understand this, you are able to go to your InfoSec teams and say, look, this is the platform, these are my options, what is approved, what is not approved, what are the mitigation techniques I can use in order to get this workflow implemented. There's some other things in terms of mitigations that are sort of standard for any enterprise. As you select any platforms, understanding what compliance standards they comply with, whether it be any one of these that are up there, FINRA, PCI, HIPAA. There are tons of them out there. Depending upon your industry and the classification of the data, you may need to understand whether the platform that you're using complies with any of those required standards. And then, also contractually binding a vendor to a DPA or a BAA if you think that when you think that the data might be going outside of your environment, and then so you have some contractual obligations between the two parties as well. So we see BAAs being executed quite often in the healthcare space, in the financial space. DPAs are also very common as executed. So having said that, what we wanted to do real quick is provide a quick primer on what the workflow is for a document processing, or what the document processing workflow looks like. Generally speaking, and again, there are many different forks that may happen in between, but this is a general depiction of the workflow. A automated process, and we have that depicted as a robot here, extracts the document that needs to be processed. Right, that document is then extracted and sent to the bottom here has a few steps that need to happen in order to process that document. The idea being, I would like to extract some information out of this document and then process that information within my systems of record, SAP, Oracle Financial, whatever the system of record, claims administration, policy administration, loan origination, servicing, whatever that platform may be. So the first step in processing a document is digitization. Digitization, we've talked about this earlier as well. Digitization is basically taking a image-based document, a document that may be scanned in or might be a picture of a document, and digitizing it so that the characters on the screen are readable by a machine, and that is done using OCR engines. That's the first step. The second step is classification. So the classification of the document, what is this document, can be done with different. So on the digitization, sorry, I forgot to mention, you have a few options on the digitization. You can use an on-prem solution, on-prem engine. You can use a cloud service. Google, Microsoft, Amazon all have services that will OCR a document for you and give you back digitized output. On the classification side, your options are either to do a local keyword-based classification or a ML model-based classification. And when you get into the ML model-based classification, you have options. You have multiple options, whether your model is running on-prem on some hardware in your data center, or whether that's being run in the cloud, or whether there's a third-party service. And we'll talk a little bit about what's available through our partners. Robert will talk about that a little later, but you have multiple options on trying to classify that document. Once you've classified that document, you need to extract data out of that document. There are multiple methods of it. Of course, there's template-based extraction, but which is going out of fashion pretty quickly. But for semi-structured documents, especially, the way to do that is through ML models, whether those be out-of-the-box models or very specifically custom models that you may have developed in order to extract data. Once that data is extracted, classified and extracted, the confidence on the extraction of the classification from the machines may not be at a level that allows for straight-through processing. So there's a lot of times need for data validation by a human of that extraction. So there's data validation that happens, and after that is structured data that gets in structured formats. Robert, would love to hear a little bit about how the document understanding product provides some options for each one of these: digitize, classify, extract, and validate options, and what are the different techniques you use in terms of implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think you alluded to, we try to provide a variety of in-house solutions across the spectrum, and then also bring in third-party solutions where we think it's valuable to the process. So when you look at the OCR component, right, the first thing that you have to do in extraction, we do have those embedded solutions, things that run alongside the robot, very popular libraries or solutions from Microsoft, Google's Tesseract, OCR. Those are embedded alongside the robot and can extract information directly. You do have the option to use a third-party OCR solution, and keep in mind, each OCR solution might work better for certain documents, certain languages, right? So when it comes to that fine-tuning process, you might explore different solutions, but we do have that Google Cloud option, Microsoft Azure, those as external options. What we also have, though, is UiPath's very own document processing service. So our own document OCR, right? An external link or service that you can access to process your documents. And in all of those external cases, what you're doing is you're sending the document, not for permanent storage, but you're sending it outside to an external services, whether it's Azure, whether it's Google Cloud, or whether it's UiPath service. It does not mean that it's being stored permanently, but it's being used to process that document and return a result to your UiPath workflow. The next thing you see here with the classification, right? We do have that keyword-based classification and more intelligent classification. What you'll see is the trend is the more AI that you're trying to leverage really across this process. A lot of times you need more processing power, and for that, that's what you're using an external service for. So with the classification, you'll have basic keyword processing capabilities, but then also something that can look more intelligently across all of the keywords or all the words that are in the document, discover some very interesting relationships so that it can distinguish between what's an invoice, what's a receipt, what's a purchase order, what's a claim document. All of those different distinctions could be made by leveraging a little bit more AI through that service. At the extraction level, you really have a lot of options. At the foundational, most simple level, you have just basic pattern recognition. Some of you might know it as regular expressions. And when I say that, that's looking at things like finding or discovering email addresses, social security numbers, things that have a very discernible pattern. That's just something that's used as in a normal UiPath workflow. But we have those more, again, intelligent capabilities when you look at our machine learning extractors, for instance. Those can look and leverage AI models to look across 10,000 different types of receipts, right, which come in all different formats, but it can extract the information out of any receipt that it sees using external models. We provide that solution as part of UiPath's cloud environment, but we also make it available for on-prem. And when I say that, what I mean is your robots still operate on their machine, but you would have to install or set up your own service, right? Your own instance of what we call UiPath's AI Fabric. And that just allows you to use those models to look at a variety of receipts or invoices. And we have it for, a number of different document types, and you can train your own documents. So if you're looking at a completely different document format than what I just mentioned, you would be able to do that as well through a service, whether it's on-prem or whether it's using UiPath Cloud. At the validation level, you have two major options. You can have someone that's looking in real time, after each document is processed, they're able to see, popping up on an attended robot, one that's on their local machine, a validation to say, hey, is this information that was extracted correct? But you also have the option to store that information that gets extracted and have it be presented to any number of users actually inside of the UiPath cloud platform or an on-prem version of what we call the UiPath orchestrator. So you can now have business or action users that can look at it real time, or you can set it up inside of an environment where they log into, and it's just a web application, and they can go through and they can say, all right, this this document looks good. They could see, 100 or 200 or 300 different documents, and it could be parsed out across all of the different workers, and they could go through and check off and say which documents look good. They can make any modifications that are necessary. And when they say, okay, this document is now fine, it's the trigger for the robot to continue with its own process. So again, they can look at it locally or they could do it in the cloud. And the last one, that export capability, you can export locally to CSV, Excel file, right? Any number of things that you would want to do locally, but you also have the option to store extracted information in the cloud environment, or if you have an on-premises orchestrator server where you keep track of all things tied to your robot activity, you would be able to store it in that environment as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Robert, for that. So based on what Robert had just mentioned, we wanted to quickly go through a little bit of, a recap of what Robert had just mentioned in each one of these steps, so you understand whether there is a transmission component in a particular step of the workflow, whether there's a storage component in a particular step of the workflow, and then you're able to then describe this to your InfoSec team, your enterprise architecture teams, and they can tell you what your options are and how you should architect it and so on and so forth, and they'd be able to help you. So in the digitization, if you are using a on-premise local digitization engine, which comes inbuilt within UiPath, you can use any one of the ones that Robert mentioned, be it your OmniPage or your Google Tesseract engine or Microsoft's local engine, or so that obviously there is no transmission there. However, if you decide to use a cloud-based OCR engine, and we see that those engines are getting better by the day, right? So the Google Vision API provides you an OCR service. Microsoft has one, Amazon has one, Amazon Textract service, so on and so forth. And these are all digitization services that have that require you to transmit that document out there. They're generally not stored in the cloud. However, they're processed there, and then a result is returned back to you. So understand that there may be a transmission component when you're looking at digitization. On the classify, if you are using, as Robert had mentioned, a local keyword-based classifier, for instance, you may not have any transmission. But if you are using any ML models for classification, then there's a possibility that there's a transmission of data between various environments, be it on-prem to the cloud, so on and so forth, in the classification area as well. Extraction, there are two components here, right? So now in extraction, it's not only just transmission, but you also have some data storage components to extraction, because once the data has been extracted, it either gets stored for validation, or it might be stored for other reasons, for example, retraining or things like that, right? So there's a storage component in the extraction, which is sort of tightly coupled with that validation. So depending on how you're doing validation, that storage could be local, right? Whether you have it on-prem, it could be on a file share, so on and so forth. And then that is presented to the person validating that document, because that document needs to be presented to a person. And if you are using, let's say, the cloud orchestrator and the cloud action center in order to do document processing, you may have to store that a copy of that document up in the cloud as well. Now, the interesting thing with UiPath is it allows you to add storage buckets, and those storage buckets could be within your cloud instance, for instance, a blob storage in your AWS or Azure instances and things like that. So understanding that there's a storage component there, and of course at the export side there's a storage component there as well. So we've explored sort of these options. Very happy to answer any questions. We're at almost our time, and I already see that there's a couple of questions. What I wanted to do is next hand it over to Jason. This is just for for an example's sake, this is a architecture diagram that we had implemented a document processing for one of our customers. And Jason, take it away if you want to explain the different components here, what we're using for digitization, and then what we're using for extraction and storage, and where those things reside.
Yeah, no problem, Ahmed. So this is a case study that we had where we're essentially in this diagram we're depicting an implementation of a overall architecture of a document processing solution. So in this situation, the enterprise InfoSec policy allowed for the transmission of data, but not for the storage unless the storage was in AWS. So if you notice in that AWS bucket, that's where we would have Orchestrator, SQL, along with storage for our model. But the main component I want you to look at is the actual on-prem solution and more or less the flow of data. So in this solution, we had all of our files, all of our documents that we would want to go ahead and analyze. It would be in our file share. So our bots would go ahead and need to access this along with our attended bots, which business users would be using to go ahead and validate and do things of that nature. But the main section is that the first three bots that would be analyzing the data that would come from that file share would need to digitize this in order to understand it. So at first, they would have to access it and then make a secured HTTPS call to Google Cloud Vision in order to have it in a machine readable form. And once this is done, but mainly what I want to note here is that that is simply a transmission of data through an HTTPS channel, which is temporary, right? This is all data that's being processed in memory on Google side, and it's not persisted and stored on a disk. So it's simply in RAM, and once that becomes out of memory, it's no longer accessible by Google. So it's simply for transmission, not storage. Now, once that is done, we go ahead and get our request back, and now we have a response of data which the bots can go ahead and continue their processing and communicate with Orchestrator, passing that data back to AWS in order to store it in some bucket, which will then allow us to retrain our model and essentially allow for better model analyzations going down the road. And we're also at the same time communicating in SQL, storing logs, and using UiPath and Orchestrator essentially to create and store better data in terms of like logging, job starts, and things like that in our SQL server. But yeah, that's overall this solution. The main thing is we're transmitting data outside of the organization temporarily, receiving a response, and then everything else happens as needed and abides to our InfoSec policy.
Perfect. One of the things to note here is that the Google Cloud Platform, of course, they had their own subscription and they used their subscription, so it was in their control. And for that subscription, of course, they had their own agreements that governed that subscription, so on and so forth. And they had done the due diligence to make sure that the Google Cloud Platform was good for them. Of course, that was done at an enterprise level. The other thing that people also ask about is what is the data that may be stored on the orchestrator. Sometimes folks are actually using the cloud orchestrator for UiPath. So it's very possible that you may extract data and put it on a queue. And in that case, you have a little bit more control where you can see what elements of data do you want to put on a particular queue and what elements shouldn't go there, so that you abide by your InfoSec policies and not send any sensitive data out. So you know that if there's a patient ID or a social security number that is extracted in the digitization process, you make sure that number never actually goes up to the cloud in the queue. It only is a pointer to a location where that document sits. So when the attended bot comes back, it knows where to go and pick that up. So those are a few things to think about. There is as I said, feel free to use the questions panel to send in your questions. We're almost at time, almost a minute over. We have a question from someone who says, does the correction go back and train the model as a feedback mechanism? Yes, that is true. However, it requires you to do some to set up some locations where that data is stored. do that feedback loop, set up some training pipelines that is included within the AI Fabric product, within UiPath and in some other products such as Abby or some of the other products that's also available. However, again, the concept is the same. Understanding what data needs to go back out for training. Of course, you don't always train in real time. These things are done sort of more in a batch mode. So you would have some sort of policy that would govern how that data sits, where that data sits, how long will it sit for, so on and so forth. Perfect. I would like to thank everyone who joined today. Thank you for taking some time to listen to us. Robert, it is a pleasure to speak with you again. I'll see you again in a few minutes on another call, but thank you so much. And Jason, you as well. We really appreciate everyone showing up today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.